And now for the poems of William Blake, from Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience. A little bit about the man. He had no formal education. He was homeschooled, and he was apprenticed to the engraver James Basire. And engraving he would go on to include engraving to a pretty striking extent with his own writing and the publication of his own works. In typical romantic fashion, he was a lifelong mystic who supposedly had divine vision since he was 4, the romantic idea of a divinely penetrated world, piercing through the veil of what most people accept as reality and seeing what lies more deeply. Privately revealed personal strain of Christianity, so still Christian but very unorthodox, very personal interpretation. Again, a very romantic idea. At 4, he supposedly saw God in his window. At 8, a tree full of angels. And as an adult, the prophet Ezekiel, he claims. He and his wife happily married, but childless. Now, you can look this up. Just Google it. Check out pictures of William Blake's illuminated works. This is where that engraving apprenticeship came in. He came up with his own method of printing, satisfying both vocations at once, a poet and an engraver. Now, what are his illuminations? Well, he drew. He created illustrations for his own poems, as you will see if you look up his illuminated works. Especially the Songs of Innocence and the Songs of Experience. But you have to appreciate how much labor went into this, because he created this printing process himself. So he would write his poems, obviously in cursive or calligraphy, and he would put an illustration, a picture, a bit of art along with it, so the two would coexist, but he would create a print and then he would engrave it. In other words, make a kind of metal stamp. But think of how that works. It's like how a stamp would work. He would have to do that by hand, backwards. That way, so he could roll some ink and then just lay it down and make multiple copies, and personally color each one by hand. Very labor intensive, but he was dedicated. Not only that, he didn't just illuminate his own works. He also has illustrated works for Milton's Paradise Lost, for instance, and Dante's Divine Comedy. But his wife helped him, so hey. And a very eccentric man, but as you will see from his poetry, also a very good and, dare I say, cool man. But very eccentric. You can't be a lifelong mystic without being eccentric, right? He developed an elaborate private mythology. In other words, he would, much like how the ancients created gods for abstract concepts like love and rage and war and, lightning and stuff like that, abstract ideas and natural phenomena. Blake would also create his own mythology. For instance, Urizen, for example, would be the name for oppressive rationalism, which you can associate with the Enlightenment, the ideology of which, of course, Romanticism runs directly counter to. His poetry relies heavily on personae, the plural of persona, to avoid egotism. Assuming a persona, not only in poetry but in literature and even the performing arts in general, is when you take on an identity from a first-person perspective that is clearly not your own. You're assuming a character. His poetry blends the visionary with the observational, and he employs, here's that individual expression and experimentation that is such a hallmark of Romanticism. There's quirky spelling, capitalization, and punctuation in his poetry. Now, songs of innocence and songs of experience. Today, of course, we take for granted that they usually are published and talked about together. However, originally, Songs of Innocence came out on its own in 1789, and later, 5 years later, Songs of Experience, he felt the need to publish that as kind of an explanatory, a subtle explanatory accompaniment. And it's through these poems that we get the quote-unquote William Blake style, or the William Blake poem, hallmarks of which are a tension between an innocent speaker and an experienced reader. The effect is disturbing, ultimately, because in Songs of Innocence you have a child who is usually undergoing something terrible, but their innocence kind of insulates them from the full reality. But of course, we as adult, more informed, less naive, more experienced readers, we are horrified by the reality that we can read around the persona's perspective, their very innocent and naive perspective. The result is a disturbing undertone to generate moral shock. The tension would become refined 5 years later with the joint publication of Songs of Innocence with Songs of Experience. Blake, of course, did that because he got the drift that not everyone, quote-unquote, got what he was doing with Songs of Innocence. But when you look at the two side by side, it's perhaps a bit more clear. The personae in the Songs of Experience poems are, as opposed to the ones in Songs of Innocence, more grown up and more disillusioned and less naive. Adult, if you will. And Blake's themes to look out for in this selection of poems, the inhumanity of the industrial age. How it really doesn't seem, it's very callously, doesn't take humanity into account. Religious hypocrisy, hey, a little carryover from Tartuffe. Religious hypocrisy and the misinterpretation of religion. Racial and class prejudice. The corruption of a biased society. The dangers of materialism. Free will and the problem of free will, its pros and cons. And the power and the responsibility of the poet. Because, of course, it's this romantic idea comes from an arguably arrogant place, even among the best, is that the poet is a specially gifted person who uses their greater insight to inform everyone of their perspective through their art. Okay. Good luck with your discussion questions.